Pacem, per Dominum nostrum Iesum Christum Filium Tuum, qui tecum vivit et regnat in unitate Spiritus Sancti Deus.
On reaching the word Deus of the prayer's conclusion, he pauses before beginning the preface. Then he turns the pages of the Missal to find the preface.
Per omnia saecula saeculorum.
Amen.
Dominus vobiscum.
Et cum spiritu tuo.
Taking a closer look,
Sursum corda.
Habemus Dominum.
Gratias agamus Domino Deo nostro.
Dignum et justum est.
Vere dignum et justum est.
he raises his hands and facing the Missal holds them parallel to each other at the height of the shoulders, continuing the preface.
Et te veneratione beatem Mariae semper virginis collodare benedicere et predicare, supplici confessione dicentes. Sanctus.
When he begins the Sanctus, he joins his hands and bows moderately. Regesting himself at the Benedictus qui venit, he makes the sign of the cross.
Domine Domini, Hosanna in excelsis.
He extends and raises his hands, whilst also raising his eyes to the cross at the same time.
Digitur clementissime Pater, per Iesum Christum Filium Tuum Dominum nostrum, supplices rogamus ac petimus. Ut accepta habeas et benedicas, ec dona, ec munera, ec sancta sacrificia libata.
These signs of the cross are made over the chalice and the host together. Keeping his feet facing the altar, the celebrant turns the upper part of his body somewhat towards the Missal. In doing so, he keeps the Missal and the oblata between his extended hands. The celebrant will turn to face the altar when he blesses the oblata and when he bows. At the memento, he raises his hands and joins them, holding them at the top of his breast or near his face without touching it, and bows his head slightly. In doing so, he makes remembrance of those for whom he wishes to pray. Then he extends his hands again and continues the canon.
Et nota devotio propribus tibi oferimus, per qui tibi oferunt hoc sacrificium laudis processus omnibus, pro redemptione animarum suarum prospe salutis et incolumitate.
The celebrant uses his left hand to turn the pages of the Missal. Each time he turns a page of the Missal, he places his right hand on the altar. If it's before the consecration, outside of the corporal, whereas after the consecration, on the corporal.
Communicantes et memoria venerantes in premis gloriose semper Virginis Mariae, genetricis Dei, et Domini nostri Iesu Christi, sedet beti Iosef et Iosem Virginis sponsi, et beatorum apostolorum ac martyrum tuorum Petri et Pauli, Andrei Jacobi, Ioannis Thomé Jacobi, Philippi Bartholomei, Mattei Simonis et Tadei, Lini Cleti Clementis, Xisti Cornelii Cipriani, Lorenzi Chrysogoni, Ioannis et Pauli, Cosme et Damiani, et omnium sanctorum tuorum, quorum meritis precibusque concilias, ut in omnibus protectionis tuum moniamur auxilio, per eundem Christum Dominum nostrum. Amen.
At the conclusion of the prayer Communicantes, the celebrant joins his hands. When he says Hanc igitur, he spreads his hands over the oblata, keeping them joined together by the thumbs, which are crossed right upon left. He will only join them again at the end of the prayer.
Hanc igitur oblationem servitutis nostre, selecum te familie tue quesumus Domini, ut placatus accipias iesque nostros in tua pacilis panas, atque ab aeterna damnatione nos eripi, et in electorum tuorum iubeas crege numerari per Christum Dominum nostrum. Amen. Quam oblationem tu Deus in omnibus quesumus, benedictam, adscriptam, ratam rationabilem acceptabilem que faceri dineris ut nobis corpus, et de sanguis via delectissimi filii tui Domini nostri.
He blesses in the following manner. The first three signs of the cross are made over the chalice and host together, the fourth solely over the host, and the last solely over the chalice. Having finished the prayer, he joins his hands and bows his head to the cross. If a ciborium filled with small hosts is to be consecrated, the celebrant uncovers it. If necessary, he lightly wipes the tip of the index finger and thumb of each hand on the corporal, while saying,
Qui predier quam pateritur,
he takes hold of the host,
accepit panem in sanctas et venerabilis manus suas,
raises his eyes for a moment to the cross and lowers them immediately again.
elevatis oculis in caelum a te Deum Patrem
He bows his head profoundly at the words.
tibi gratias agens,
He makes the sign of the cross with his right hand,
benedixit,
taking the host also with his right. The celebrant continues.
deditque discipulis suis dicens, accipitet manducat ex hoc
He
omnes.
pauses a little, bends down over the altar, laying his elbows on it. He pronounces reverently the words of consecration.
Hoc est enim corpus meum.
Still holding the host, the celebrant genuflects and adores the Blessed Sacrament. He raises the sacred host with both hands so that it can be seen by the people while continuing to keep his eyes on it. He reverently lowers the host and lays it on the corporal with his right hand. Should there be a ciborium which has been consecrated, the celebrant covers it, having genuflected. Let us have another look at this.
Qui predier quam pateritur, accepit panem in sanctas et venerabilis manus suas, et elevatis oculis in caelum a te Deum Patrem sum omnipotentem, tibi gratias agens, benedixit fregi delitque discipulis suis dicens, accipitet manducate ex hoc omnes. Hoc est enim corpus meum.
From this point onwards, until the ablutions, the celebrant, when not handling the host, keeps the index finger and thumb of each hand always joined together. The celebrant uncovers the chalice. Holding the index finger and thumb of each hand over the center of the chalice, he lightly rubs them together to detach any tiny fragments of the host which may by chance have adhered to them. Then, standing erect, he says,
Simili modo postquam scenatum est.
taking the chalice with both hands, having raised it a little for a moment,
Accipiens et un precalorum calicem in
he then
sanctas et
replaces it on the
venerabilis
corporal.
manus suas.
He bows his head.
Idem tibi gratias agens.
He makes the sign of the cross over the chalice.
Benedixit.
His left hand is placed on the foot of the chalice. He continues,
Delitque discipulis suis dicens, accipite et bibite ex eo omnes.
having finished the words, he leans his arms on the altar, raises the chalice a little, bends down over it, and reverently pronounces the words of consecration.
Hic est enim calix sanguinis mei, novi et aeterni testamenti, mysterium fidei, qui pro vobis et pro multis effundetur in remissionem peccatorum.
He places the chalice on the altar, whilst saying in a low voice,
Et quatiescumque feceritis in me memoriam facietis.
he genuflects and adores the precious blood. Rising, he takes the chalice in both hands and slowly raises it so that it can be seen without difficulty by the congregation. While elevating the chalice, the celebrant keeps his eyes fixed on it. He reverently lowers the chalice and covers it. He genuflects. Let us have another look at this.
Simili modo postquam scenatum est, accipiens et un preclarum calicem in sanctas et venerabilis manus suas, item tibi gratias agens, benedixit, delitque discipulis suis dicens, accipite lubite ex eo omnes. Hic est enim calix sanguinis mei, novi et aeterni testamenti, Mysterium fidei, qui pro vobis et pro multis effundetur in remissionem peccatorum. Et quotiescumque feceritis, in me memoriam facietis. Undet memores Domini nos servituis et plebs tua sancta iusem Christi fili tui Domini nostri tam beate passionis nec non et ab inferis resurrectionis sed et in celos gloriose ascensionis offerimus preclare maiestati tui.
As usual, the priest joins his hands before making the sign of the cross. The first three signs of the cross are made over the chalice and the host together, the fourth solely over the host, and the last solely over the chalice.
Ostiam puram, ostiam sanctam, ostiam immaculatam, panem sanctum vitae aeternae et calicem salutis perpetue. Supraque propicio serenutur respice retineris et acceptabere sicut acceptabere dignarius munera pueri tui justiabel et sacrificium patriarche nostri Hebrae et quod tibi obtulit sumus sacerdostus Melchisedec sanctum sacrificium immaculatam ostiam.
At the words Suplices te rogamus, he bows profoundly, holding his hands joined and resting on the edge of the altar. He kisses the altar, redresses himself, and makes the sign of the cross first over the host and then over the chalice.
Supplices te rogamus omnipotens Deus, iube perferi permenus sancti angeli tui in sulema et aretum et conspectu divine maiestatis tue ut quod. Ex altaris participationes sacrosanctum filii tui corpus et sanguinem sumserimus.
Then he signs himself and joins his hands.
Per Christum Dominum nostrum. Amen. Memento etiam Domine famulorum quetuarum, qui nos precesirum cum signo fidei, et dormiunt in somno pacis.
For the memento of the dead, he raises his hands and joins them, and fixes his eyes on the sacred host, while making a short commemoration of the dead for whom he should pray. He extends his hands, continues the prayer, joining his hands again and bowing at the conclusion of the prayer.
Ipsis Domine omnibus in Christo qui escentibus locum fregeri lucis et pacis ut indulgeas et precamur per iundem Christum Dominum nostrum. Amen. Nobis quoque peccatoribus.
As he says the words nobis quoque peccatoribus, the celebrant strikes his breast lightly.
Mattia Barnaba Ignazio Alexandro Marcellino, Petro Felicitate Perpetua Gata Lucia Agnete Cecilia Anastasia, et omnibus sanctis tuis, intra quorum nos consortium, non estimator meritis et venie quesumus lagitor admite.
At the conclusion of the prayer Nobis Quoque, he joins his hands and disjoins them again, making three crosses over the chalice and host together.
Per quem omnia Domine semper bona creas, sanctificas, vivificas, benedicis et prestas nobis.
For the prayer per ipsum, the celebrant uncovers the chalice and genuflects. He takes the host with the thumb and index finger of his right hand. Then he transfers his left hand to the node of the chalice and makes the sign of the cross with the host 3 times over the chalice, saying, Per ipsum et cum ipso et in ipso. And immediately he forms 2 other signs of the cross over the corporal between the nearer rim of the chalice and his own breast. He then holds the host straight over the chalice, and there steadying his right hand, he raises the host and the chalice a little in a straight line, saying,
Omnis honor et gloria.
Having laid the chalice on the altar and the host in its usual place, he purifies his fingers over the cup, joins his thumbs and forefingers, and covers the chalice with the pool. Both hands on the altar within the corporal, genuflects, and then says,
Per omnia saecula saeculorum.
Let us have another look at this.
Per ipsum, et cum ipso, et in ipso, est tibi Deo Patri omnipotenti, in unitate Spiritus Sancti, omnis honor et gloria. Per omnia saecula saeculorum.
Amen.
Oremus. Receptis salutaribus moniti et divini.
It is important to notice what the priest does with his hands.
Pater noster qui es in celis sanctificetur nomen tuum, adveniat regnum tuum, fiat voluntas tua sicut in cielo et in terra. Panem nostrum quotidianum da nobis hodie, et dimite nobis debita nostra, sicut et nos dimitimus debitoribus nostris, et ne nos inducas in tentationem.
Sed libera nos a malo.
Amen.
At the end of the Pater Noster, the celebrant says silently, Amen. He places his left hand on the altar, and with his right wipes the paten with the purificator. He takes the paten between the index and middle finger of his right hand, and with his left hand still on the corporal, he says,
Libera nosque sumus Domine ab omnibus malis praeteritis presentibus et futuris, et intercedente beatate gloriosa Sancte Virgine Dei Genetrice Maria, cum beatis apostolis tuis Petro et Paulo et qui Andrea et omnibus
he
sanctis.
signs himself with the paten and kisses it while saying,
Ta propitius pacem in diebus nostris,
he slips the paten under the host,
ut ope misericordiae tue adiuti,
uncovers the chalice,
et a peccato simus semper liberi,
he genuflects.
et ab omni perturbationis securi.
He takes the host between the thumb and index finger of his right hand, brings it with both hands over the mouth of the chalice, and breaks it reverently, saying,
Per iumdem Dominum nostrum Iesum Christum Filium tuum,
he replaces the right hand half of the host on the paten. With the thumb and index finger of his right hand, he breaks off a fragment. As he continues to hold this fragment over the chalice with his right hand, he uses his left to place the left half of the host on the paten, placing his left hand on the node of the chalice, and still holding the fragment of the host over the chalice.
Per omnia saecula saeculorum.
He then makes 3 crosses with the sacred particle over the chalice from rim to rim, saying,
Pax Domini, sit semper vobiscum,
Et cum spiritu tuo.
et commixio consecratio.
The celebrant lets the particle fall into the chalice. He rubs his 4 fingers and thumbs over the chalice and covers it. Let us have another look at this.
Libera nosque sumus Domine ab omnibus malis praeteritis presentibus et futuris, et intercedente beatate gloriosa Sancte Virgine Dei Genetrice Maria, cum beatis apostolis tuis Petro et Paulo, ad qui Andrea et omnibus sanctis, da propitius pacem in diebus nostris, ut ope misericordiae tue adiuti, et a peccato simus semper liberi, et ab omni perturbationis securi. Per iumdem Dominum nostrum Iesum Christum Filium tuum, qui tecum vivit et regnat in unitate Spiritus Sancti Deus, per omnia saecula saeculorum.
Amen.
Pax Domini sit semper vobiscum,
Et cum spiritu tuo.
et commixio consecratio corporis et sanguinis Domini nostri Iesu Christi, fiat ascipientibus nobis in vitam aeternam. Amen. Agnus Dei qui tollis peccata mundi, miserere nobis. Agnus Dei qui tollis peccata mundi, miserere nobis. Agnus Dei qui tollis peccata mundi, dona nobis pacem. Domine Iesu Christi, quid existi apostolis
The celebrant, having placed his joined hands on the altar and being bowed down, fixes his eyes on the sacred host.
Et quod donare dineris qui vivis et regnas Deus per omnia saecula saeculorum. Amen. Domine Iesu Christe, Filii Dei vivi, qui ex voluntate Patris cooperante Spiritus Sancto per mortem tuam mundum vivificasti. Libera me per hoc sacro sanctum corpus et sanguinem tuum, ab omnibus iniquitatibus meis et universis malis, et fac me tuis semper inherere mandatis, et atenumquam separari permittas, qui come vedem Deo Patre et Spiritus Sancto vivis et regnas Deus in saecula saeculorum. Amen. Perceptio corporis tui, Domine Iesu Christe, quod ego indenius sumere presumo, non mihi proveniat in judicium et condemnationem, sed pro tua pietate prosit mica tutamentum mentis et corporis et ad medelam percipiendam, qui vivis et regnas cum Deo Patre in unitate Spiritus Sancti.
Before receiving Holy Communion, he genuflects, redresses himself, and says,
Panem celestem accipiam et nomen Domini invocabo.
he holds the host between the thumb and index finger of his left hand. Then he slips the paten under the host and holds the paten with the 3 remaining fingers being bowed down. He strikes his breast 3 times, saying,
Domini non sum dignus ut in tre subtectum meum, se tantum di verbo et sanabitur anima mea. Domini non sum dignus ut in tre subtectum meum, sed tantum di verbo et sanabitur anima mea.
He places the right hand half of the sacred host over the left, and takes them both in his right hand. He makes the sign of the cross with them. Then, keeping his forearms on the altar and being bowed down, the celebrant reverently receives the sacred host. He puts the paten on the corporal, joins his hands, redresses himself, remains for a little while in meditation of the Most Holy Sacrament.
Panem celestem accipiam et nomen Domini invocabo.
Let us have another look at this.
Domini non sum dignus ut in tre subtectum meum, se tantum di verbo et sanabitur anima mea. Domini non sum dignus ut in tre subtectum meum, se tantum di verbo et sanabitur anima mea. Domini non sum dignus ut in tre subtectum meum, se tantum di verbo et sanabitur anima mea. Corpus Domini nostri Iesu Christi, custodiat anima meam in vitam aeternam. Amen.
The celebrant uncovers the chalice and genuflects.
Qui retribuam Domino pro omnibus qui retribuit mihi.
He then takes the paten and gathers up whatever particles of the sacred host may remain on the corporal. He carefully purifies the paten with the thumb and index finger of his right hand over the chalice, rubbing his thumb and finger together over the chalice too. Still holding the paten in his left hand, the celebrant takes the chalice with his right.
Calicem salutaris accipiam et nomen Domini invocabo. Laudans invocabo Dominum et abilimicis meis salvus ero.
He signs himself with the chalice, saying,
Sanguis Domini nostri Iesu Christi, custodiat anima meam in vitam aeternam. Amen.
Holding the paten under his chin, he reverently receives the precious blood and a particle of the sacred host which is in it. He replaces both the paten and the chalice on the corporal and then covers the chalice. If Holy Communion is to be distributed, the celebrant, having covered it with the pool, places the chalice towards the back of the left-hand side of the corporal. He opens the tabernacle, genuflects, and takes out the ciborium, which he then uncovers. Once the Confiteor has been recited, the celebrant genuflects and, turning partly towards the congregation, says aloud the Misereatur Vestri and the Indulgentiam. He takes the ciborium in his left hand and one of the sacred hosts between the thumb and index finger of his right. He turns towards the congregation and says aloud, and then says 3 times,
Domini non sum dignus ut in tre subtectum meum, sed tantum di verbo et sanabitur anima mea. Domini non sum dignus ut in tre subtectum meum.
The celebrant then distributes Holy Communion, saying aloud the words,
Corpus Domini nostri Iesu Christi, custodiat animam tuam in vitam aeternam. Amen.
He returns to the altar, genuflects, covers the ciborium and replaces it in the tabernacle. He genuflects, then closes and locks the tabernacle. He purifies the communion plate over the chalice. The priest, either having received the precious blood or having purified the communion plate, takes the paten in his left hand, and keeping the chalice above the corporal, he holds it towards the epistle side of the altar. The celebrant joins his thumbs and index fingers together over the cup of the chalice, whilst the server pours both the wine and the water over them.
Amen.